Welcome back everyone. Today we're making a mini duffel handbag. This bag measures in at 6 by 9.5 inches, and when you collapse it down into the mini pocket, it measures in at 6 by 6 inches, making it great to use as a handbag or a day bag. This sewing project is also on the easier side, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, if you are new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need 1 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a canvas, denim, or twill. These are all very durable fabrics and easy to work with. I'm actually going to be using a mixture of a few different fabrics. The first one is an upholstery fabric. If you're new to sewing, you might want to stay away from these fabrics. They're very loosely woven and sometimes harder to work with. I'll also be using a heavyweight canvas, a non-stretch Sherpa, and lastly, a lightweight nylon. And the best thing about picking out your fabric is that you get to pick out what you want to make. So if it's not one of the fabrics I recommended, that's totally fine. You might want to test it a few times and get used to working with that fabric. But in the end, you can pretty much use any fabric to make any type of bag. So have fun and get creative with it. You'll need 1 to 2 zippers. The first zipper is a 10-inch zipper, and this is for the main bag opening. The second zipper is for the collapsible bag, and this is an optional feature. If you're choosing not to make this pocket, you don't need the second zipper. And a quick tip when it comes to buying zippers, I like to buy mine on a roll, so that way I can cut my zippers precisely to the sizes I need. This helps reduce a ton of waste, and it also gives me the freedom to make any size pocket I want. You'll need 2 to 4 yards of 1-inch width webbing. If you don't plan on making the duffel bag strap, you'll only need 2 yards. And you can change up the width of the webbing if it's gonna go more with your design. I found that 1 inch works perfect with the size of this bag. You can go more narrow, and it looks good too. Going along with the webbing, you'll need 2 lobster clasps, 2 D-rings, and 1 strap slider. And the biggest thing you want to keep in mind here is you want to match the width of your hardware to the width of your webbing. So since I'm using 1-inch width webbing, I'm going to be using 1-inch width hardware. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you start taping your pattern together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. Once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move on to cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results. From here, we're going to cut on the outside of the black line. You should end up with 1 inside pocket top front panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 inside pocket bottom front panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 inside pocket back panel cut out of your main fabric, and these first 3 panels are optional if you're choosing to make the inside pocket. 2 top side panels cut out of your main fabric, 2 main side panels cut out of your main fabric, 1 bottom side panel cut out of your main fabric, and lastly 1 main base panel cut out of your main fabric. Moving on to assembly, we're going to grab the inside pocket top and bottom front panels. Along with the panels, you'll need your smaller zipper. In the zipper size, you only need it to be the same width as these panels. We're going to be clipping the ends. So as long as the zipper goes past the ends of the panels, you should be good to go. Using the pattern, we're going to locate the zipper edge on both panels. With the zipper edge located and the right side of the fabric facing up, we're going to place the right side of the zipper to the right side of the fabric, directly on the zipper edge of the bottom front panel. And from here, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the right side of the zipper up, place a few pins so the zipper stays in place. Take the top front panel and do the same thing on the opposite side of the zipper. Make sure you're lining up the sides of the bottom and top panels. Once it's aligned, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold up both panels so the right sides are facing up. And from here, we're going to push the zipper seam allowance towards the top and bottom and add a top stitch. We're going to do this for both sides of the zipper. When it comes to adding a nice clean top stitch, I highly recommend looking into an edge presser foot. And as you can see, the top stitching made it nice and flat along that zipper edge, and also helped clean up the raw edges on the wrong side of the fabric. For the next step, we're going to flip back around to the right side. Make sure your zipper train is in the center of both of the panels. Grab the inside pocket back panel. And what we're going to do is find the right side of the fabric and place the right side of the fabric on top of the right side of our complete zipper panel. Stitch the outside edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving the top edge open. When it comes to stitching over the zipper, just take your time, hand crank the machine if you need to. Most needles should go through the zipper no problem. After finishing up the stitch, double check both sides just to make sure that both of the panels and edges are all lined up. If everything is looking good, we're going to snip the zipper ends flush with the seam allowance. We want this bag to look good on the inside and outside because we're actually going to be having the wrong side of this bag out on the inside of the bag. So what we're going to do is clean up these raw edges by adding double fold bias tape. But before we start adding it, I'm going to run you through a few different techniques that should really help you out when it comes to adding bias tape. The first method is using a bias tape making kit. In this technique, you make your own double-sided bias tape to the size and fabric you want to use. All you do is cut your strips, feed it through your folder, and press it when it comes out the folder. It's very easy to do, and you get to customize the bias tape to your exact measurements. The second technique is using a double fold bias tape binder. This is the most efficient technique. You cut your strips, feed it through your binder, and sew it directly to your raw edge. And the last technique is using pre-made double fold bias tape. You are limited to colors, but it's very easy to use. You fold it over the edge and stitch it down. And you want to make sure you apply it all the way around the outside edge. I'm going to be using the double fold bias tape attachment. If you plan on making a lot of bags, I highly recommend looking into this. It gives the nicest end product and cuts down production time. As you can see, I started and stopped for each edge and left the top open. Since this pocket is going to be on the inside of the bag, I didn't spend too much time trying to bias tape around the corner. So what I'm going to do is clip close to the edge and fold the ends over and add a tack stitch. I'm just doing a standard tack stitch to lock the end down and try to hide that raw edge on the back. Repeat this process for your opposite corner, check your work, and your inside pocket is complete. Since this pocket is on the inside and we're using it to collapse down the bigger bag, we keep the wrong sides facing out. So that way when we collapse down the bag, the right sides will actually be facing out. But anyways, for the meantime, you can place this complete pocket panel off to the side and grab your main base panel. Before we add the webbing to this main panel, we're going to start by adding our bottom side panel. So grab the bottom side panel, and what we're going to do using the pattern, we're going to place it directly in the center of the main base panel. And as you can see, once you have it lined up in the center of the main base panel, the webbing straps will go directly over top of the bottom side panel. But before we add the webbing, the best thing to do is to tack down the bottom side panel. This will help keep everything tacked down and aligned. Place the wrong side of the bottom side panel to the right side of the main base panel, double check to make sure it's directly in the center of the main base panel, and stitch both side edges as close as you can to the outside edge. Once the panels are stitched together, I highly recommend checking to see if that bottom side panel is still in the center, and from here we can place this panel off to the side and grab your two 30-inch strips of 1-inch webbing. These are going to end up being the handles, so you can cut these to any length you want. I recommend trying this to start and then adjusting it as you go for a bigger or smaller handle. What I like to do is line up the webbing ends so they're facing each other, flip the webbing so it's all facing one direction, and lastly place the webbing strips together. The sides that we're facing up should be facing each other. When the ends are perfectly lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, we're going to separate the webbing strips and flatten out the seam allowance. From here, we're going to add a tack stitch to both sides of the webbing strip. Go ahead and repeat this process for the opposite side. When you're finished, you should end up with one full loop. And the idea is to make these conjoined areas as flat as possible so it's easier to stitch them down to the bag. Not only is it easier, but it looks nicer too. From here, you can place this webbing loop off to the side, grab your main base panel. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the webbing placement guide. The quickest and easiest way to do this is fold the pattern at the webbing ends and mark just the ends, and repeat this process for the opposite side, making sure you have the pattern lined up on the main base panel. Lay out the webbing loop, lining up the center of the loop with the center of the main base, and the outsides lined up with your marking. It's best to pin it down so you can see what it's going to look like before you stitch. Because at this point, if the handle is looking too long or short, you can change it before you stitch it down. But anyways, we're going to keep moving on, so we're going to stitch a box stitch all the way up to those markings and back down. Again, I'm using an edge presser foot so I can get a nice straight stitch along that webbing. I also recommend using a thread color that matches your webbing so it hides any imperfections. After finishing up the stitch, it's best to double check to make sure the webbing is parallel with the outside edge of the main base panel. If everything is looking good, you can add another box stitch, tack stitch, or an X stitch to the webbing ends. These areas take more strain when pulling on the handle, so it's best to reinforce them. And that's going to do it for adding the strap. You can use different materials like leather or vinyl. Different materials will bring out a different look and quality to the bag. From here, we're going to grab our top side panels, separate the panels with the right sides facing up, slide these panels to the side, grab your complete main base panel, place the panels on each side of the bottom side panel. We want the top side panel to overlap with the bottom side panel 1/4 inch so it covers up the stitch on the bottom side panel. So place the right side of the top side panel to the right side of the bottom side panel, lining up the outside edges. Pin both of these panels down so they're not moving around as you're stitching, and go ahead and stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your time and go slow over the bulky areas. From here, we're going to fold the top side panels down and add a top stitch to that inside edge. Repeat this process for both sides of the top side panels. Matching the thread with the color of your fabric can really make your project look professional. We want to do the same thing for the opposite edge of the top side panel. Using the pattern as a guide, we're going to roll the edge over 1/4 inch and add a top stitch. And there's a bunch of different ways to get these edges to roll over perfectly. I found pressing them is the best way to go if your fabric allows it. The fabric I'm using is a little plasticky and stiff, so I'm just going to roll it over as I sew. If you're doing it this way too, I found placing a few pins really helps out and keeps everything aligned as you're stitching. I kind of think of it as sewing checkpoints, and it just makes it a little bit easier. Like always, after you finish stitching, double check both sides, make sure all the layers got stitched together and everything is centered. I like to check this by folding the bag in half and seeing if the top side panels line up. If everything is looking good and lined up, we can place the panel flat with right sides facing up. The fabric I'm using for the main base panel is loosely woven, so it's unraveling a ton. If you're having a similar issue with your fabric, the best thing to do is to serge or zigzag stitch the outside edge. This will immediately stop the fraying and clean up the outside edge. It's probably best to match the thread to the color fabric you're using so that way it's a little more hidden. But anyways, I work with a lot of loosely woven fabrics and I found that doing this really helps out in the long run. Moving on, we're going to flip the panel to one of the outside edges. It doesn't matter which one. Grab our 11-inch zipper, place the right side of the zipper down, and we're going to line the wrong side of the panel up with the wrong side of the zipper, keeping the zipper centered in the panel. Place a few pins and stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it might look a little strange adding a zipper like this, but we're going to cover that raw edge up in future steps. So flip around to the wrong side, let the zipper seam allowance lay flat, and add a top stitch directly on top of that back edge. Depending on your fabric, it can get a little bit bulky, so take your time. This doesn't totally hide the raw edge on the right side of the fabric, so we're going to flip over to the right side and take care of that. I found that this zipper technique is a really fun way to bring out the details in the bag, and what we're going to be doing is adding webbing directly over that raw edge. When it comes to the webbing, you can choose any width or even any material that's going to go with your bag. Pretty much anything that has a clean edge can be used to cover this raw edge. You mainly want it to be wide enough so that way it goes into the zipper and also into the bag just a little bit. But anyways, have some fun with it, try some different materials. I'm actually going to be using the 3/4 inch webbing, and I'm going to pin equal parts of the webbing on both the zipper and the main base panel. Stitch both sides of the webbing as close as you can to the outside edge. Take your time and try to make it as neat as possible. After finishing the stitch, double check both sides. Doing this technique gives you a clean edge on the inside and outside of your bag while only using one layer for the main base panel. Moving on, we're going to spin the panel to the opposite side edge. And pretty much we're going to do the exact same thing with the opposite side of the zipper. But before we do that, if you're deciding to add the optional pocket, we're going to add that first. So grab your pattern, locate the inside pocket placement guide, grab your complete inside pocket, the main base panel so the wrong side is facing up. Referencing the pattern, we're going to place the inside pocket directly in the center of that side edge, trying to keep both the top edges lined up. For the inside pocket, you want the wrong sides out and the zipper facing up. To keep this pocket from moving around when we're adding the zipper, we're going to stitch it down. Stitch as close as you can to the outside edge, and I'm going to be using a serger so that way it cleans up any of that raw edge on that inside bag. Just like that, our inside pocket is in position and ready to move on to the next step. But before we move on, I just want to go over, you can actually adjust the size of this inside pocket. You can make it smaller or larger. It's a super easy feature to customize to your preference. Moving on, we're going to flip the bag back over to the right side and sew the outside edge of our zipper to the outside edge of our main base panel. Fold the zipper in half, lining up the wrong side of the zipper to the wrong side of the main base panel. Also keeping the top and bottom edges lined up, place a few pins and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, we're going to double check to make sure the outside edges are perfectly lined up. If everything is looking good, we're going to separate the zipper so that way we can lay this bag out flat. Locate the side we just added the zipper, fold the seam allowance so the zipper edge is flat, and add a top stitch. If you did add the pocket, it can be very bulky, so take your time and use a heavy weight needle. Do a quick once over to make sure all these layers got stitched down. If everything is looking good, we're going to flip over to the right side. And just like on the opposite side of the bag, we're going to grab our strip of webbing, place it directly in the center of that raw edge, and stitch both sides of the webbing. I highly recommend taking your time when you're working with this many layers. They can shift around, so just be cautious as you're sewing. Double check both sides, make sure all the layers are lined up with the zipper, stitched down, and looking good. If everything's looking good, we're going to lay the pattern out flat with the right sides facing down so we can fold it in half and add our zipper. A quick little tip, I like to pull my zipper all the way through and add it once again so that way both of my sides are perfectly sealed shut. This is going to make it a little bit easier when we're adding the D-rings in the next step. Grab 2 4-inch strips of your 1-inch webbing. Feed the strips through your D-rings with equal parts of the webbing on both sides. Place the strip directly on top of the zipper with about a 1/2 inch hanging off the edge. You can actually adjust this and play around with how much of the webbing you want to show outside of the bag. You can also even make the webbing strips longer if you want. It's totally up to you, and it's a super easy detail to customize. When you're satisfied with the look, pin the webbing strip down and repeat the process for the opposite side. Tack stitch both of the webbing strips down as close as you can to the outside edge. If your machine has post-bed capabilities, I found it's easiest to slide this panel right in and add your stitch. Check to make sure your webbing strips are lined up perfectly in the center of the zipper. If everything is looking good, we can place this panel off to the side and grab our main side panels. Along with these panels, we're going to grab our complete assembly, flip the wrong side out. When you have the wrong side flipped out, we're going to move towards one of the side openings. Place the right side of the main side panel directly in the center of the opening on the main assembly. Pin around the outside edge, flip it around to the opposite opening, place the right sides together, pin around the outside edge, and stitch both sides at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Keep in mind this is the trickiest part of the bag, so if you need to do this a couple times to perfect it, that's totally okay. Just take your time and try to make these stitches as neat as possible. And once you finished up adding the main side panels, you're so close to being done, we're going to snip all of this outside junk flush with the seam allowance on the main base panel. And if you have any other excess fabric around the outside edge sticking past the sides, you can go ahead and snip that flush with the seam allowance too. For the next step, we're going to clean up those raw edges just like we did on that inside pocket panel. This is simply done by adding double fold bias tape around the outside edges for both of these main side panels. Adding this to the inside of the bag really takes your project to the next level and makes it look professional, and also it's going to make it way more durable. At this point, the main portion of your bag is complete, so we're going to flip the right sides out. Do one last look over around the outside of the bag, make sure all the edges are looking nice and there's no layers sticking out or we can't see any of that serge. If everything is looking good, before we add the branding, we're going to place this bag off to the side and start working on our duffel strap. Cut 1 2-yard strip. You can cut this longer or shorter, but I recommend starting at 2 yards and trimming it down. Start by grabbing your strap slider and placing it on your webbing. Feed the webbing through both openings of the slider and move the slider about 1 foot down the webbing. Grab one of your lobster clasps. Feed the webbing through the opening on the clasp, the same side as the slider. The next step can get kind of confusing, but we're going to take the same end of the webbing and feed it through the slider from the back side, starting at the furthest opening and then feeding it back through the nearest opening. When the webbing is through the nearest opening, we're going to pull it out about 2 inches, roll the webbing end over once, and lay it back onto the opposite side it went through the first opening. Move the other webbing out of the way and add a nice tack stitch. With the webbing end tacked down, we're going to move to the opposite side of the webbing, grab our last lobster clasp, feed the webbing end through the opening on the clasp, roll the end over once, and place it on the opposite side of the webbing, and add our final tack stitch. And you can actually do a box stitch, an X stitch, or just a couple bar tack stitches. All these stitching techniques will hold the strap together and work nicely. As you can see, the strap slider moves up and down the strap nicely, adjusting the strap. And this is why I say start with 2 yards for this type of strap, because you can really adjust it to be fairly small. Grab the bag, locate the D-rings, clip the clasps to the D-rings, and you can try on your bag. This duffel strap is super easy to make and it looks really nice. The fun thing about it is that you can always make different ones and change them out. It's just one of those fun things to do when you make your own bags. And lastly, I want to show you how to collapse this bag down to the inside pocket. Take off your duffel strap, open the bag, find the inside pocket, reverse the inside pocket so the right side is facing out, and stuff the rest of the bag inside that pocket. It's just a fun extra feature, giving yourself the ability to throw this bag in another bag or make for better storage. But anyways, the final step is branding. I like to put my tags in areas I can clip things to. I'm using a branded piece of leather that's attached with double-sided rivets. And there you go, your mini duffel handbag is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hopefully your bag turned out just as good as mine, and if it didn't the first try, sometimes these bags, they take a few tries to really perfect the style of sewing. When it comes to making smaller bags like this, it can be harder to put on the side panels and get everything to line up perfectly. But with each bag, you'll get more practice and your bags will start looking great the first try. Like always, I wanna see what you come up with, so tag me at ProperFitClothing on Instagram. But until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.